So we were finding that many of the female students were going in the introductory and sort of intermediate programs, but then when it came to joining the accelerator, the numbers really dropped off. And we weren't really sure why that was. And so we did speak to them about what was driving their decisions. And a lot of it was a confidence piece, insofar as that they felt that even though they had great ideas and they'd done the hard yards in terms of validation and that they had gone through all of our existing training programs, they didn't feel confident in themselves or in their idea, or that they would have the capability necessary to start their own startups, essentially. And so we really wanted to address that.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Dr. Jessica Gallagher is in charge of external engagement at the University of Adelaide and was formerly the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Global Engagement and Entrepreneurship at the University of Queensland, UQ. At UQ, she has transformed the student experience by embedding entrepreneurial thinking into the educational curriculum for every discipline. She oversaw the creation of UQ Ventures and led their LeadHers program in helping 1,214 female participants to build confidence and grow leadership capabilities. Jessica is also a director on the board of the Kokoda Track Foundation, where she provides expertise and support in improving the lives and futures of Papua New Guineans. In this conversation, we discuss learning the power of education from her father, who was a teacher, studying abroad at Germany, and how it opened her mind to different cultures, languages, and ways of thinking. The importance of entrepreneurship studies for all disciplines and specialties. Her work to increase rates of female student enrollment in UQ's accelerator program and to provide them with the tools and confidence to succeed. And the importance of stepping outside of your comfort zone and continually challenging yourself to keep growing. This conversation with Jessica is one of a dozen or more upcoming conversations with designers, authors, scientists, investors, and entrepreneurs who are changing our world for the better. If you don't want to miss them, please follow our show on your favorite podcast player. And now, let's jump right in with Dr. Jessica Gallagher. All right, I'm sitting here with Dr. Jessica Gallagher. Jessica, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
So these days, we always start with COVID and the pandemic. That's still a very massive force in our lives. And I'd love to hear how it affected you and, what was it like where you were? You're in Queensland, Australia right now. I'd love to hear anything about that.
Yeah, so we've got quite an interesting story to tell here in Australia, insofar as that for most of 2020, it was business as usual. Our borders were all closed. And so when you work in international education, that does bring about some challenges insofar as you're not able to obviously go and visit partners in person. And we haven't been able to welcome our international students to our campuses. But everything pivoted to online really quickly. And because we had very low cases of COVID, we were still able to really get out and about. There were very few lockdowns, certainly not in Queensland. But sort of fast forward now to 2021 and the rest of the world is opening up. And unfortunately, our vaccination rates are still relatively low. We've had the Delta strain. And so now we have very large numbers of the population in lockdown. Queensland is still relatively open, but there isn't really a clear sense yet as to when our national borders will open up, when there'll be freedom of movement between states. We sit on a knife's edge in terms of when there might be certain clusters or outbreaks. And so that does create a degree of complexity and ambiguity as you look at planning, because you really never know what the next week will bring. So we're looking forward to a time when we can sort of identify our own COVID normal, and I'm not sure that we've found that as yet. So It's been good. I feel like the rest of the world has been able to open up and move on, and we're still a little stuck.
That's an interesting, it's a very different timeline than most people experience, I think. at least in my circle. And we're on the opposite side of this, I guess. In Israel, we experienced everything very quickly, and the vaccine came in and really helped reduce the caseload to the point where now the prime minister is trying to actually reduce closings, reduce lockdowns, even for people who are sick. They used to then, up until now, they essentially isolate everyone they came in contact with. So
Yeah.
now they're talking about only isolating them because the death rate is so low because most of the population is vaccinated. So it's an interesting, almost like a lab experiment where every country is experiencing something a little bit different. And yet there's a lot of also global similarities. And you were working in global engagement, right, at the time. So how did that affect your work specifically?
So my last trip was in February 2020, and that was to India. And that was really right before it became real in terms of the impact that it was likely to have in Australia. And that has been really odd for me insofar as that because my role has been very much around international relations and recruitment of future students, that typically I would be overseas every 4 to 6 weeks. And so we've had to really look at the way that we conduct the business. And so fortunately, everybody was in the same boat. And so we really did become quite adept at using technology. And so running symposia and research forums and workshops online, whereas typically we would have done that in person. And so there's been some great lessons learnt insofar as in order to strengthen and cultivate partnerships, you don't necessarily have to do that in person. In fact, that we have some great tools at our disposal. Where it's harder is where you don't have existing relationships. So when you're trying to build new connections and you haven't necessarily built that rapport, that's obviously much harder to do in a virtual landscape. At the same time, we've been very fortunate that a lot of our international students have stayed with us. So at the moment, we have about 11,000 international students who are studying with UQ, but are actually studying online from their home countries. So that's a pretty significant proportion of our student body. And so it's been really interesting to look at how our academic staff, but also our professional staff have innovated and created really interactive student experience and online teaching tools and interactive lectures in a really short period of time. And we've done something very similar with our entrepreneurship activities, actually, because previously that was all delivered in face-to-face, but last year we had no choice but flip that online. And now we're offering a lot in hybrid mode because we have both those from a domestic perspective that are here on campus, but such significant numbers that are offshore that we want to make sure that we're able to cater and provide access to these programs to all of those students. And so that's been really fun too, is looking at how you build these communities and you deliver the content when you're working with both face-to-face and online cohorts. It's been good fun.
You're also involved with the KTF. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, and that involvement with COVID is, I guess, a quite different experience.
Yeah, so I'm on the board of, so it's Kokoda Track Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organisation that really looks at improving prosperity of Papua New Guineans. And that has been really difficult work in a pandemic because the levels of poverty are quite staggering and they don't necessarily have the infrastructure, the connectivity across the country to support the types of health initiatives that need to be implemented when you've got these very large pandemic outbreaks. And so, again, that's been looking at how you deliver services online and what the strategies are to support the team that are based there locally. We've had some really significant challenges around the vaccine uptake in Papua New Guinea. There's a really high degree of skepticism and resistance to the vaccine. And of course, when you're working in communities that are really rural and remote and don't have access to the kinds of health infrastructure that you and I would take for granted, means that is representing a significant cost of lives and people are very ill. So, it does definitely, I think, many people have said this, but COVID-19 really is a great virus for the developed world. Insofar as that, if you have the capacity to isolate and you have the capacity to work from home and you have technology and infrastructure around you, then you can manage. But if you're in a population where you work, where you have to be out and about and that it's every day, if you don't go to work, you literally can't feed your family and you don't have the services and support, it's a very different type of question. I think that across the board, in terms of the work that we do in development and in developing countries, we've certainly seen the experience directly the level of privilege that we have.
Yeah. I think this is maybe another example of the future unequally distributed,
Oh,
where it's in the right time where much of humanity can continue to work and operate online, but it's not evenly distributed. Not everybody
no,
has access to it.
no,
And if it came in 100 years, it would be essentially nobody would be in that position. Everybody could work remotely, but it's not, we're not there.
definitely not there.
To start the kind of exploration today, so we have this opening question that we like to ask that we found works to start an interesting conversation, which is, what's something you've learned early in life that still drives you today?
That's a great question. The first thing that springs to mind, and this may seem cliche given the role that I'm in, but is the power of education. So my
Mm,
father was a teacher and really instilled in me the value of an education. And so I spent a lot of time with him as a small child in his classroom, going there after school and being in his office and seeing his interactions with students and his sort of passion for learning. He was an English and history teacher. And so
mm,
understanding the impact that history has on the present and the importance of reading and the importance of having an open mind and challenging the status quo, I think that has really stuck with me insofar as this really strong belief in that education can change lives, but it really can change the world. And so providing access to all in whatever way we can has
mm.
something that's certainly driven me and definitely aligns with my professional values.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How do you feel it sort of shaped your early decisions as you moved around the world? Did you know that you were going to go into academia, into teaching?
No, not at all. I think I certainly didn't have a nice linear career path.
Mm,
I think that in many ways, I took it for granted insofar as that there was always this expectation. And I certainly had that for myself. And I think my family were really strongly encouraging that I would continue through secondary education, that I would go to university. I'm one of five
mm,
children, actually. I'm the only one who's actually finished a university degree. My siblings all started and then found other paths in life. And I
mm.
really stuck it in. I think I've done enough degrees for everybody in the family, but certainly stuck with it. But I think that it was really this more the curiosity, the desire to learn, the desire to read and to know more than I do. And I think that's something that has absolutely continued insofar as this curiosity for the world around me and a knowledge that there's so much more that there is out there for me to learn.
Interesting. And so you started early on, if I'm not mistaken, with languages and literature. Talk more about that.
Yeah, the language piece was a really odd start insofar as that when I started high school in year 8 in Australia, I had a choice between, I think it was Chinese and German. And Chinese seemed too complex for me because they didn't use the same alphabet. And so I
Mm,
became quite interested in German language and I found that I was quite good at it. And again, I think it spoke to that desire to gain new insights and to that curiosity to get an understanding of how different cultures worked and different histories and how that sort of played out in terms of the present. So I continued with that. And then I actually enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts where I was doing journalism, German, and Russian of all things because it just intrigued me. It wasn't something that everybody did, certainly not in Australia anyway. But I found that my German was much stronger than my Russian. And so after my first year of study, I actually decided to take a break and I went and lived in Germany for 3 years. And so I worked and studied there and absolutely loved it. Just, it was an amazing time, amazing opportunity. And that sort of fueled then continued desire to improve my language skills. But again, as I said, this sort of understanding about how different countries and different cultures orientate themselves. And that sort of led to my PhD in comparative cultural studies.
yeah, interesting. I always enjoy when I go work in a new country or with a new group of a new nationality to look at these differences because they're so powerful. I experienced it personally moving from Israel and living in the States for many years. And just seeing how the things that were completely normal and nobody would bat an eye in Israel were big no-nos in business
Yeah.
culture in America. For instance, arguing with your boss is a lot more normal in Israel. It's called kind of like an argumentative debate culture. Did you notice anything like that in Germany that stayed with you, that kind of opened
Yeah.
your mind?
Yeah, look, so much actually. Insofar as I remember talking to friends over there about, so in Australia, we would have signs and commercials that sort of say, made in Australia and proud to be Australian. Whereas in Germany, they never had that. And they found that really strange that we would put that on products, that we would actively promote the fact that this was something that was made in Australia and that was something that we were really proud of. On the flip of things, I think that there was always this sort of sense of guilt that a lot of Germans still harbour around the atrocities of World War II and the extent to which that continues to flow down through the generations, and this desire to really unpack historical events and understand how they've happened and why they've happened. And this concept in German is called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and it means coming to terms with the past, which is such a cool word in itself, but something that I've never really experienced in the same way in Australia, despite the fact that, we don't necessarily have the greatest track record either when it comes to our First Nation people and Indigenous communities. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? The things that you do take for granted and the difference of attitudes and approaches.
Yeah. One thing I heard from Europeans who come to Israel, they're always shocked with how many flags there are everywhere. National pride is something that in Europe has a bad history. And in Israel, it's viewed differently. It's a fairly new country. We're still building it. We're still trying to make it work. And so there's flags everywhere, which is interesting. So tell me how you get from studying German and literature all the way to entrepreneurship and the stuff you do today. That must have been quite a journey.
Yeah, it's again a really good question insofar as, and like I said, I don't think that it was a linear path or anything that was specifically spelt out insofar as one day sort of thinking to myself, well, I'll do a PhD and then I'll end up as a Pro Vice Chancellor of Global Engagement Entrepreneurship. It certainly wasn't the case. So when I started my PhD, I really had thought that I would end up in the academic stream. And so I figured that I would end up teaching in humanities, and whether that was in the comparative cultural studies area or whether that was sort of European cinema or language studies. But I found that about halfway through my PhD that it's quite isolating in the humanities. It's very much you do the research by yourself. It's not like some of the STEM fields where you're usually part of a project team working on a particular experiment. Yeah. You're in exactly that sort of lab environment. Whereas in the humanities, it's a very sort of individual type of activity, or has been. I think that's changing more now. And I realized that as much as I really enjoy teaching, which I do, and I have always loved teaching and still do bits of it now, I didn't really love research insofar as research for the sake of research. And so to be a successful academic, you really have to love research, because it's so much around how you then progress within the field is to research and publish and continue to research and then publish some more. And so I found that, but I really enjoyed working in the university environment. About halfway, 3/4 of the way through my PhD, I ended up actually starting in the professional stream and was the manager of our domestic recruitment activity. So I was working on my PhD part-time, and I sort of started this role with responsibility for recruitment of Australian students to the university, which was a great job. It was really fun, actually, at the time, helping shape the futures of bright young minds in terms of giving them advice about what their paths might be. And from there, I really just took advantage of opportunities that were presented. And I spent some time working in our graduate school, which was a role that was very much focused around student engagement and looking at career development opportunities. I then became the director of one of our student experience offices. And so with that role, had a great opportunity to shape student leadership and enrichment programs. And it was there that I gained an interest in the international education part of the business, and so transitioned to a role with global engagement where I was responsible for international relations and strategic partnership work for the university, and really looking at the way in which we engaged in various countries to support research and teaching and learning and other forms of engagement initiatives. And it was in 2018 that there was a decision made that we wanted to centralise the entrepreneurship activities of the university. And at the time, I was part of an external engagement portfolio, and I don't think that they really knew where to put this entrepreneurship entity. They wanted it to sit outside of the academic and the research portfolio because it really needed to work across all elements of the university. So it absolutely had to connect with the teaching and learning space and definitely had to connect with what was happening in our research activity, but also was about our connection to partners, both industry as well as global partners. So they decided that they would pilot this construct of a global engagement and entrepreneurship office. And so we started with a pilot and were charged with developing a strategy for the university. And then we looked at how do we grow the programs and really look at ways that we could expand beyond, I guess, the traditional sort of cohorts of the business and engineering students and look at offering programs that spanned across the whole array of essential entrepreneurship, right from ideation all the way through to an accelerator, an incubator type of program. And the pilot worked, and that the rest, I guess they say, is history. So it's been that way since 2018, and it's been phenomenal actually to see the growth of the programs, but also to see the connectivity with the global engagement part of the business. So at the University of Queensland, we have a very global orientation to our entrepreneurship activities and finding ways that we can provide students with opportunities to spend time with partners and to immerse themselves in startup hotspots around the world and share best practice with other universities that have a strong entrepreneurship agenda. So we made a success of the pilot in a way that I don't think that many have. People still question why we've got our international relations and our entrepreneurship piece together, but it's been really great fun.
Yeah, interesting. So there's an interesting aspect here, which is embedding the entrepreneurship in every program and kind of across programs. Why is that important?
Yeah, it's so important. And it's something that we still are educating our broader university community on, insofar as I think that entrepreneurship has typically been associated with business students, and then to maybe a sort of a secondary extent with our engineering students. But we found that good ideas span all disciplines, and it's actually how you bring those disciplines together that you really create innovative solutions to our big challenges. And so we've been very focused on showcasing across all of our discipline areas, so humanities, health, behavioural sciences, engineering, business, medicine, science, the benefits of gaining an entrepreneurial mindset. And so understanding how these tools can help you look at problems differently and will give you opportunities to shape solutions in a very different way. And that's going to be of benefit, irrespective of whether you have aspirations to start your own business or whether you want to be positive disruptors within traditional sectors. And that's been incredibly satisfying, actually, to sort of see how students from what would be non-traditional disciplines have really responded to getting involved in entrepreneurship workshops. And so we run workshops for students in agriculture, in drama. We've done all kinds of really fun things in psychology and occupational therapy and physiotherapy. We ran a really great session recently for the medical school and actually worked with our academic staff to showcase why entrepreneurship was a really great thing to have as a medical student, because the medtech space is incredible. And so when you go into these programs, you have choices. There are lots of great things that can come about by actually working with, bringing together medical students with our engineers and how they create different types of solutions and technologies. So that's been incredibly satisfying and something that we obviously hope to continue to expand in terms of our reach.
Yeah. It's interesting because it feels like these traditional jobs that where you would just finish, get your degree and get a job, that seems to be shrinking. Or if it's not shrinking now, it's at least at risk. And I'm looking at the people who are getting a law degree, and I'm looking at the people who are getting, an accounting degree. There's more and more tools that can do most of that, and et cetera. You wrote that in today's economic environment, we don't need job-ready graduates, we need job-creating graduates. In general, like in any of these fields, right? Going in and not thinking, now I need to find someone to give me money and tell me what to do, but thinking, what do I want to do? Yeah, is there any particular example? Because I feel like I'm constantly meeting people who are very good at what they do professionally, and they say, but I can never make a living doing that. And what they mean is, I can never find someone to pay me to do that. But you can find, if you change your mindset, and all you have to do is convince 1,000 people to pay you a little bit, right? It's the difference between one boss and 1,000, small sponsors. So yeah, is there any kind of stories that stick in your mind that really are a good example of this kind of mindset in where you wouldn't expect it?
Yeah. So I think that I'm a really strong proportion of the fact that, so in Australia, we talk a lot about kind of job ready graduates and this sort of training people to come out so that they're ready for a job. But we know that the jobs of the future don't even exist yet, insofar as so many of our graduates will go on to careers in industries and in roles that haven't even been imagined yet. And so I think that nimbleness and that agility to be able to respond and to pivot as required, but also this capacity to chart your own path, and the concept of not only creating a job for yourself, but creating jobs for others. I think that in order to achieve economic recovery in this country, but economic growth is going to be completely dependent on creating a culture whereby we actively encourage people to look at how they can take an idea and create a successful business. And in a university environment, we're very fortunate that we've got lots of examples of people who have done just that. Teams that have come out of our accelerator program that started as students with an idea, and then with some access to mentoring and some advice and some exposure to the investment landscape, have been able to chart really interesting careers for themselves, but then have employed graduates of the university and others.
Right.
And that is really across all sectors. So we have a lot of really successful stories in the edtech space, not surprisingly, education technology. We have great examples in medtech where, so one of our medical students decided to do an MBA as part of his studies. He's created these incredible headphones and looking at ways that you can support people with hearing challenges, and that's been listed this year and is creating all kinds of opportunities in terms of employment. We've had people that have been really active in environmental sustainability and have created businesses that were focused on composting. Might not seem like, the newest idea, but they've done amazingly and have been able to seek investment, and now they're hiring people. And so creating these opportunities, and it really is across all sectors. I mean, we've supported teams in our accelerator that have had sort of fintech, certainly medtech, edtech, lots in sort of space technologies.
Wow.
There's been numbers that have looked at social enterprises as well. So I think that it's about thinking about careers differently insofar as is that, why not start your own business? There's nothing to stop you insofar as it really is just that confidence in your own abilities. There is plenty of funding out there. I mean, it's not always easy to access immediately. And it takes a bit of grit and determination. And I stand in awe of the people who have made that decision to do it. But what we want to do in an institution like UQ is to provide them with the tools and networks to make this a possibility should they wish.
Yeah. Now, one of your key focus areas is women in entrepreneurship. And I read that you had 1,214 female participants, and you have this program, LeadHers, which is a nice play on words. And what needs are you meeting for these women? How are you helping them? And, to play the devil's advocate, obviously I can guess some of the solution, but why is this program necessary?
Yeah, look, there's so many answers to this particular question. But so what we found, I guess, just to sort of pull it back to the beginning point, insofar as that we found in developing our entrepreneurship programs that the uptake from female students was much lower. And so we really wanted to look at ways that we could support greater participation from our female students into our entrepreneurship programs, particularly in the later state program. So we were finding that many of the female students were going in the introductory and sort of intermediate programs, but then when it came to joining the accelerator, the numbers really dropped off. And we weren't really sure why that was. And so we did speak to them about what was driving their decisions. And a lot of it was a confidence piece insofar as that they felt that even though they had great ideas and they'd done the hard yards in terms of validation and that they had gone through all of our existing training programs, they didn't feel confident in themselves or in their idea, or that they would have the capability necessary to start their own startups, essentially. And so we really wanted to address that. It also was a reflection of the fact that we know that there are still some really significant system and structural issues that exist that make it harder for female founders to access investment and funding, and that they're just not necessarily as present when we look at the sort of startup culture that we have in Australia. And so the idea was creating a program that was specifically designed to provide our female students with access to entrepreneurship tools, but really focus on leadership and confidence building, that we would be able to not only support the students that were interested in starting their own businesses, but also give our female students a greater degree of confidence that would help them in their leadership journeys, irrespective of the sectors that they wanted to enter into. It's been phenomenal in terms of demand and growth. So we started with a mixed cohort, which included undergraduate master students and PhDs, as well as some staff and alumni. And systematically, we have developed specific cohort programs. And so we now have dedicated programs for coursework students, for research students. We ran a program just this week, actually, that was focused on professional staff within the university, so supporting female staff within the institution to build their leadership skills. And we're also developing a new program that's focused at future students, because if you go to schools and you ask, and you sort of say, well, you thought about being an entrepreneur, many of them don't even know what that means, and we find that that's particularly the case for female students. So, yeah, that's a little bit of the reason why.
It's interesting. I feel sometimes also a lot of the confidence game around entrepreneurship is understanding that nobody knows what they're talking about. So it's like you're judging yourself as if you're comparing yourself like to a perfect standard that doesn't really exist. And it takes some exposure to actual entrepreneurs. And the first thing they'll tell you is, I don't know, I tried things. I didn't know what the right thing to do was. And you understand that they're no different from you in a way. So was that your experience? You know enough to get started is kind of the message. Nobody has full knowledge. Nobody has full certainty.
No, absolutely. So I think it's about giving them that confidence to back themselves, and this sort of understanding of the fact that, nobody really knows what they're doing. And this is why we surround ourselves with great peers, and we seek mentors, and we engage with those that might be able to point us in the right direction and give us some advice. But really, it's about having that confidence in yourself that I think that's what our programs are trying to do. So absolutely equipping them with the tools and the knowledge and the networks, but also really helping them to identify that self-confidence, basically, to take the leap.
Yeah. You also contributed at an organization called SheEO, another play on words, but very interesting organization. So I would love to hear more about this program, but I would also want to throw out there that I often talk to male friends who are very jealous of these support structures that exist for female entrepreneurs. And I know that the answer that you could give this is like, well, men have everything else. But there's something there that's really supportive, that's really, where it exists, that's a resource that's available that is not so available. There are programs that teach in Tel Aviv, teach female coders how to get started with coding. And there isn't an equivalent for men. Like if you want to learn coding as a man, you just have to buy a book or a course, or there's no support. So how do you feel about this discrepancy, which I wouldn't call it, it's probably still unequal to the other side, but there's something interesting here. How do you think about this?
I think that I don't know that I have the answer, insofar as what I know is that there is absolutely a gender imbalance in the startup ecosystem. And that's not just in Australia. That's all over the world. I think in Australia that we have roughly, I think it's less than 23% of our founders are female. And so that does speak to the fact that there are structural and system challenges that have existed over a long time, insofar as access to funding, access to the support networks that have been available, I think, more readily for men. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have programs that empower our male students or male colleagues to engage in this space at all. But I think that it's quite clear when you look at the data that these imbalances do exist. And if we really want to ensure diversity within our business communities, we need to look at how we close the gap. And so you mentioned SheEO, which, I've been an activator of SheEO now for a couple of years, which essentially just means that I make an investment as part of this company, and it's really supporting investment in female founders who are working on some of the biggest challenges of our time. And it's about how we provide finances and mentorship to really help up-and-coming female-founded startups, because the fact is that there are significantly fewer female founders in the ecosystem than there are males. Yeah. And I'd love us to get to a point in time when we're talking about 50-50, and then it's sort of looking at, making sure that there are equitable access to all kinds of programs. I think sometimes we need to come together to do that. And I think sometimes you do need specific dedicated programs to, as I said, address those gaps.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. But so part of, I think, the thing that you've been working against throughout your work with UQ seems to be trying to counter siloing, trying to counter people being in their own bubble and creating these cross connections. And you do that also internationally, right, with global communities. Is there kind of an ideology there? Is there some principle that we can learn from this?
I think this goes back to just the importance of diversity of perspectives. And so when you bring together students from different disciplinaries, they're able to bring those strengths in terms of the knowledge that they've acquired as part of their studies that they've gained in their particular disciplines. But by bringing that together and mashing it up, you gain this sort of amazing new perspective on how we might tackle different types of problems. And so that relates then also to the work that we do with our international partners. So if you can overlay kind of discipline diversity then with cultural diversity and look at different markets where you have different ways of approaching particular challenges, that creates a really rich environment to look at innovation. And so that's been the key driver around trying to break down these silos and find ways to bring together cohorts who otherwise may not necessarily have had the opportunity to work together.
Yeah. So one of the pieces of news, breaking news that I can present in this episode is that you have a new job, right? It's starting soon. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've just recently accepted a role as the new Deputy Vice Chancellor and Vice President of External Engagement at the University of Adelaide, which is a big move for me because I've been with the University of Queensland for 15 years and it's an amazing institution to work for. But the role at the University of Adelaide is very broad. So it's an opportunity to continue working in the international education space, so in recruitment and international partnership work, but also with greater responsibility for corporate relations, marketing and communications, and sort of broad community and recruitment outreach. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the new challenge and the new opportunity, and very much hoping that I'll have an opportunity there to continue some of this work in the entrepreneurship space and to help contribute to the ecosystem in South Australia.
Cool. So I think it's time for our final question, which is, again, kind of a question we ask all of our guests. Alain de Botton, in his TED Talk, talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being the modern secular version where you just give a little bit of information and it's pretty dry. And a sermon is when you're actually urgently trying to change someone's life. And I ask all of our guests to give a short sermon. What is one thing that you'd really like more people to embrace or see that could really change their lives for the better?
So I think that my advice to people would be to, where possible, step outside their comfort zones. And so that might mean trying something outside of their discipline area, like entrepreneurship, where they may not have otherwise thought of themselves as being interested in a startup or innovation. Or it might be about taking themselves off to another location, so traveling and meeting new people and getting an understanding about how they live their lives, because there's so much richness that is gained by walking a mile in somebody else's shoes and understanding that the way that we see the world isn't necessarily black and white. In fact, there are lots and lots of shades of grey. And I think that's where the most exciting and interesting things emerge, is that if you're prepared to put yourself out of your comfort zone and to understand, gain a different perspective and to build your network and to build your understanding of the world, I really think that's where greatness comes. And I think that we need more of that. I think that we need more compassion, more understanding, more willingness to innovate and to challenge the status quo. Put yourself out of your comfort zone as much as you can.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jessica.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.